What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and on this second episode of the Open Source MVP series, today we have Pablo Gonzalez, the creator of Happy Soup, which, if you haven't seen it or used this open source application, it is my personal favorite and pretty impressive. So, very lucky to get to talk to him. He is going to go over a lot of the technical aspects of Happy Soup, how to use it, why you would use it. So stick with us. It's a great episode full of really, really interesting information about not only the app, but the dependency API and all of the code that goes into this. So let's get to it. All right, guys. So today we have Pablo Gonzalez, the creator of Happy Soup, a great open source piece of software that you can use for Salesforce that allows you to figure out the dependencies in your org. This is one of my personal favorite open source libraries available out there, or applications available out there. So I appreciate you coming on Coding with the Force today, Pablo. And yeah, so one of the first things I wanted to ask you is, why did you decide to make Happy Soup, and why did you decide to keep it open source instead of, I guess, packaging it up like so many other people do?
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the channel. Honestly, why I created it is a funny reason, and it all comes down to imposter syndrome, to be entirely honest. And so I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for 10 years. Actually, I got my admin certification 10 years ago last month. And so, there comes a time where you feel like, okay, I know good amount of Salesforce. But then you always see these people. There's always people that know a lot more than you, right? And even those people would look up to other people. There's always someone better than you. But for a while, I started to feel like, I know Salesforce very well, but that's it. Like, I don't know anything else. And I see now Salesforce is coming up with LWC and JavaScript, and there's all these TypeScript libraries and all this stuff happening. And sometimes I would feel like, I'm being left behind, and I need to do something to feel like I'm still valuable in the ecosystem and that I'm still learning. And so I thought a lot about creating some Chrome extension to do something like that, impact analysis or something to look at your dependencies or things like that. I wasn't really sure. I just thought, or I knew it would be like a Chrome extension. But then the idea evolved, as we'll see later, into like a complete, tiny app for dependency and impact analysis. And as far as why I made it open source, honestly, I never thought about packaging and like making it like a paid product or anything like that. I guess simply because that wasn't my intention at all. Like my intention was not to put up a business or to make more money or something like that. It was just to learn more and to do something for fun. And so, yeah, I guess I never thought about it. It was already in my head that if I was going to do it, it was going to be open source.
Awesome, man. Cool. Yeah, I definitely understand the imposter syndrome thing. I feel like no matter how much I do, I can't ever feel like I'm quite where I want to be. So,
Yeah, and it's very strong in the industry. I mean, in general, in IT, it's very strong, and especially because things change so fast, and there's so many new technologies. There's always a new shiny framework, a new shiny way of doing things, and so you feel like you're always, trying to hit a moving target. Um, and so it is very easy to feel like you're being left behind, and that you don't know enough. Obviously, I mean, like I know Salesforce has become so big that it's impossible to know it all, right? So
Yeah.
at some point you need to accept, I guess like your niche or your skill, and be happy with it. But this was a thing that I've always felt like I've always wanted to do. I always wanted to be able to create something really nice, and have it actually provide value to people. So yeah.
Awesome. Um, okay, so we're gonna do this episode a little different than I suppose the last one and probably many of the others. Pablo, thankfully, has already got a pretty good installation and setup tutorial himself on his YouTube channel, which will be linked in the description below. So if you want to learn how to set up Happy Soup, you can go there. But Pablo's going to take us a little more in depth about Happy Soup, kind of the architecture behind it, a brief demonstration of, what it's capable of, but we're going to focus more on how it was built, than how to set it up and run it. So I will let you take it from here, Pablo, and I'll ask questions,
Yeah,
if I
please.
need to.
Free. You can see my screen, right? Right.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay. All right. So let's do it. So just a quick agenda. So I'll explain what Happy Soup is. Just because we started talking about it, but maybe some people haven't used it. And then I'll give a very quick overview about what impact analysis is and why it's important, which is one of the main reasons Happy Soup exists. Then I like to explain a new concept that Happy Soup introduces to the Salesforce ecosystem called deployment boundaries. And then when it comes to the architecture, I guess the main important or the most important part is to understand the metadata component dependency object, which is it's an object of the tooling API. And then I'll give a quick overview of the high level architecture. All right, so what is it, right? So we know it's an open source project, and basically it allows anyone to see and understand the dependencies in their org, especially when it comes to impact analysis, right? And so impact analysis would be, say for example, if you're going to change a pick list value, right? I think that's probably the best example, because a pick list is a type of field that you can change an attribute of, right? Which you normally can do with other fields. With other fields, maybe you can change the length and things like that. But when it comes to a pick list, you can still have the same API name, the same label, but you can't change the values, right? And so if you have a value, say for example, called green, and that green value is used across report filters, Apex classes for if conditions, Lightning Web Components, etc. If you rename that to yellow, then the question is what happens with all those customization, right? Are your report filters going to break? Will they just disappear and then your report will be suddenly unfiltered? And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you change a pick list value. And so that's kind of the concept of impact analysis. Before you do something in your org, try to understand the impact of that. And I gave the example of custom fields, but actually Happy Soup allows impact analysis across a lot of different metadata types. So you can also do impact analysis with custom labels, right? Again, if I change the text in this custom label, who knows what's going to happen, right? Because I don't know who's dependent on this, or who or what Apex classes or Visualforce controllers, etc., are using this value to maybe make some decision-making logic. The other thing is dependency analysis, which is very similar to impact analysis, but is more around understanding dependencies the other way around, which is the deployment boundary. So it's a whole concept. So I'll skip it for now, and I'll explain it in a moment. So we spoke about, right, the impact analysis use cases, right, that report filters, Apex classes that could use a field for if or else logic. and workflow rules as well. Again, if you have a workflow rule that uses a pick list value to maybe send an outbound message, and you change that pick list value label, then again, what happens with that workflow rule? Maybe it just won't work anymore. So these are the things that you need to understand before you make changes to, to a field or a piece of metadata. And in terms of, okay, when is this actually a problem, or when does happy soup become more relevant is, say, for example, if you're an independent consultant in a new org, which I know many people work in that fashion, right? Maybe if you work for an end user for years, and potentially you understand, how your metadata is made up, and you understand the impact of changes. But if you're a brand new consultant or just a contractor who just got a new org, and you're asked to make changes to this Apex class or some field, then you have no idea what's going to happen when you do that, right? And you don't have that report or that business context to understand that firsthand. So you will need something to visualize and understand the impact of the changes that you're being asked to make. Um, the other thing that is very useful, or the happy soup and dependency analysis in general is very useful, is to understand what features something depends on. And again, if I give you the example of a consultant joining a new org and you're being asked to work on this Apex class that you had no idea about, if you think about an Apex class, what can it depend on? Well, it can depend on custom objects, and those custom objects are concepts in that org. And if you don't understand those concepts, or those, yeah, let's say business concepts, you may not fully understand what the Apex class is doing. You may understand what it's doing at a programming level, right? The if, else logic and for loops and all that. But it may not make any sense if you don't understand the concept behind those objects and those fields. So one of the things that Happy Soup allows you to do, and we'll see later, is it allows you to see what a class depends on. And when you have that information, then you can do some previous analysis of that. You step back and you study those objects, you study those fields, you study the dependencies first to build a body of knowledge. Then you can say, okay, now I have this information. Now if I read the Apex class, now the business logic is going to make sense, right? And another use case for Happy Soup, which is very rare, but I know some people use it, is you can also use it for page layout optimization, right? And this is a use case where you have tons of fields on a page layout and you want to remove some of them. And essentially what you're looking for is like some sort of data dictionary or some metadata dictionary that will tell you, okay, these are all the fields on this particular page layout. And then you can bring that to the business or to some user so that they can start going through that and say, okay, we don't actually use this field, or maybe we do use this field, but we should use it more. So one of the things that Happy Soup allows you to do is just that. It's essentially pull all the fields of a page layout so that you can do that kind of exercise. So that is the first thing before we start talking about deployment boundaries. So let me actually switch to the app, which is right here. I'm actually going to log out. So the app is a web app. Later we can talk about the other deployment options, but in principle, it's available on the web for anyone to use. So you can log in with your sandbox production or with my domain. One of the, I guess, nice features is that whatever you choose here to log in with, when you come back, it'll remember your domain. So that's why it's already there. So I'm just gonna log in here. And so let's use the example of, I want to understand the dependencies, or sorry, the impact of making changes to a custom field. The first thing we do here is we select the metadata type, which is custom field. This is loading all the fields in the org, which is so that you can then use autocomplete here. So you don't have to type in the field ID or the field API name or anything like that. So once you're here, you have two options. Well, in this case for fields, the one that makes more sense is impact analysis. Again, I'll explain the second one later. And then there are some toppings, like when you order a pizza, you can add additional things on it. It's the same concept here, but I'll explain this in a moment. So let's just do it right there, right? Where is this use impact analysis? I want to see what happens if I make a change to this customer priority field. So the first thing we see is a chart that essentially tells you what is the, out of all the metadata types that use this custom field, which one has the highest references. And this is very useful because, again, if you're trying to answer the question of what's going to be impacted when I make a change to this field, you immediately know just by this chart that the most impacted metadata type are going to be workflow rules and flows because they have the highest number of members referenced in that field. So this avoids you having to Excel these to a sheet and then do some count on the type and all that. You immediately know, okay, if I make a change, I need to look after those workflows. Then the actual members are right here, so I can expand them all or collapse them. So I'm just going to go one by one, or at least a few of them, so that I can explain. So this is a very cool feature. So when it comes to Apex classes, what HappySoup is telling you here is that these two Apex classes reference this field. They use that field. The thing is, just knowing that a class uses a field is not good enough, right? Because a class can use a field in so many different ways. It could be a SQL query, it could be a for loop, it could be an if-else branch, or it could be actually assigning values to that field. So where this becomes important is, let's say you're troubleshooting some field that has a value that you don't know where this value is coming from. Like this value is not being entered manually, it's not an integration. So you're thinking maybe there's some automation that is doing that for me and I just don't know. Well, you come to HappySoup, you run the impact analysis, and just like that, you can tell that, okay, this class is using the field, but it's only reading values from it. So maybe it's doing a SQL query, maybe it's an if-else branching logic. So, but it's actually not inserting data into that field. So I can just ignore that class. And this one that says right means that, there is an actual assignment expression assigning data to that field. So this is the class that I should pay attention to and maybe investigate if it's actually the culprit for the issue that I'm troubleshooting. And all the clicks are, all the links here are clickable. Do you have any questions before I go on?
Well, I will say, right, this is one of my personal favorite things, that it's that it displays whether or not you're writing or reading to a particular field in the code itself. And I was just curious, I know that the dependency API that is technically part of the tooling API allows you to scan for these things, but how did you end up actually figuring out how to determine, how does your code determine whether or not it's actually writing or reading to it? Is that actually somewhere in the metadata API, or did you have to write a custom function to figure that out yourself?
Let me see. I had the project open right here, and I think I don't anymore. So let me just open it up so that you can see. Essentially, it's a regular expression somewhere in the code. I need to find where that is. I think it's somewhere. Where was this? I think it's here. Oh, no, I get it. It's actually on the usage. And I'm actually going to do a walkthrough of this in some time. It's on this enhanced data. Okay, so let me just step back for a second. So if I go to the tooling API, which I actually have it right here, this is the initial query that HappySoup runs, okay? Which is just show me the metadata that references this field by the ID. So I know the field ID. So if I export that, as you can see, it's pretty raw. And like you well pointed, it just gives me the class names and it doesn't tell me anything about that. So that's it. The other thing that you'll notice is that the page layouts actually don't have the object prefix. Now, obviously we know there are account layouts because it's in the name, but the actual object prefix is not there. It should actually be like account dash account layout, because that's the actual full name that you will need in a package XML or something like that. And the same is with the reports, in the sense that, okay, the reports are there, but we don't know how the field is being used in those reports. Are those filters? Are those groupings? Or is it just a column? And last one with flows is flows actually can be process builders and flows as well. Behind the scenes, they're just represented as flows. So the tooling API doesn't actually tell you what it is. So the point of that is that when I get the initially what I do is I do that query that I just showed you. And once I have that, I have this function to enhance the data, which is essentially a nasty if else, which should probably be something else. But right now it's an if else that it looks at what type it is. And based on that, it'll pass it through a function that is going to enhance that data. So when it comes to Apex classes, it passes them to this field, sorry, to this function to get the field, to see how the field is being used.
Mm.
So essentially, this is the regular expression. So I have the custom field name, and this is an expression. I'm not gonna go through it because I don't even remember what this means today, to be honest. I knew when I wrote it after like 5 hours of Google search, but essentially it matches on this right there, like a an assignment expression. It doesn't match on this because that would be obviously a Boolean expression, and it doesn't match on other stuff. So what I do is this logic. I know that if this class is here on the result, is we know the field is being used, obviously. And at a minimum, it's being used for reading, right? It's definitely either a SQL query or an if else or something like that. So I'm making that assumption. I'm saying that that is the base case or the base scenario. And the exception is it actually inserting data into that field? So with that, what I do is then I query the body of the Apex classes that I know are using the field. And then I go through each Apex class. And if I get a match on the regular expression, which, hold on, where is it? Here, if I get a match, then I know it's definitely a write. If I don't get a match, remember, I still know that the field is there in the class somehow. So if it's not a read, so if it's not a write, then it has to be a read.
Yeah.
So I defaulted to read if I don't get a match on the regular expression. So I don't know, it's probably not perfect, but it works pretty well. I haven't had a single complaint that this actually is inaccurate. But so yeah, that is how it's done.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's pretty cool. I have the same problem with regular expressions. About, you know, 20 minutes after I'm done writing them, I've forgotten what they are. So normally I actually leave a comment for them, which it looks like you have, because I'll
Yeah,
forget it so quick.
yeah, yeah, it's true. I mean, I guess that's part of the imposter syndrome when you see someone on YouTube like writing this huge regular expression on the fly. Um, Not me. So anyway, let me go back then to Happy Soup just to keep going a bit here. So the other thing is that for layout, you'll see here, I do have the object prefix, which wasn't there when we queried from the from the tooling API. And that's again, because somewhere here on the page layouts, right? So this is actually an interesting scenario here. There are three, probably more, but three types of metadata that belong to an object metadata type. So for example, a custom field cannot exist without a parent object. A page layout cannot exist also without a parent object. And the same is with a validation rule. These metadata types are all tied, to an object. So for all these, the tooling API returns just the raw name without the object prefix, which again is useless if you want to use this in a package XML for retrieving or deploying. So for all these three here, so for custom fields, for validation rules, and for page layouts, I pass them uh, over to this function at parent name prefix. And for validation rules, it's actually impossible to get the object name fixed unless you use version 33 of the API. I don't know why, and I can't remember how I figured that out. But For the rest, for the other two is possible, but for validation rules, you need to use an undocumented field on the version 33 of the API, which I know Salesforce is going to deprecate in 5 years. So hopefully by then I will have figured out a new way of doing this. But if we go over that function, again, it's a lot of the code in Happy Soup is pretty, I wouldn't say it's bad. I'm actually proud of the code, but it's a lot of ping pong. And that's why I think Happy Soup is so complex, right? This looks like so simple, like, oh, you just get some names and that's it. But when you realize that what the API gives you is so raw, if you want to do something useful with it, you need to do a huge amount of ping pong within the APIs to make this actually useful. So when it comes to adding the parent name prefix, again, I need to do a query somewhere there to figure out. I need to get like all the objects in the org and in a map by their ID, and then I need to loop through like all the metadata. In this case, all the page layouts or all the not all of them, but the ones returned by the API, the layouts or the custom fields or the validation rules, and I need to match them uh, to an object prefix and then reconstruct the name based on that. And then here, there's actually a very good example of a misplaced responsibility. I saw your video on separation of concerns, and this totally should not be here because what's funny is that the function is meant to be generic because of the nature of these three objects where they all belong, sorry, of these three metadata types where they all belong to an object. So it is generic, like 98% of it, except here it says, oh, well, and if it's a layout, because layouts have such a weird URL,
Yeah.
I construct the URL right there. And yeah, maybe this should actually be somewhere else. Like maybe this should be its own function, and I should put it here as part of the layout here, right? So the first thing should be add parent name prefix, and then there should be something that says, you know, uh, fix link, and then pass them again, and then return them with the correct link. That's probably where it should be. Um, but it was convenient at the time, so yeah.
Well, hey, I lead several teams of developers these days, and what I always tell them is, the first thing you want to do is, at least in my opinion, is prove it can work. Second thing you want to do, if you're not doing it in tandem, is write the tests to prove that it works, and then you go back and refine it. So, I mean, I can tell you myself, I'd probably still unfortunately have things like that laying around in code I've written that I didn't have enough time to go back and refine. But yeah, man, this is one of the reasons that I wanted to ask you, or that I asked you about that question, is because I'd been experimenting a bit with the dependency portion of the tooling API myself, and I knew, you can't get this information, right? You've broken this down so much. I wanted to kind of highlight that, and I don't think, like you said, I don't think people understand that you can't just query the metadata API and get what you want. You have to do like so much more after
It's
that
so
to get
much, yeah.
done. Yeah.
So I can tell you, Happy Soup is incredibly complex, and this is not to just say, oh, I'm so great. It's just it's very complex. Like I wish that tooling API would return everything that I just showed you, but it doesn't. And as you can see, um, even for lookup filters, now this is a funny one. I don't have an example here, but for lookup filters, actually the metadata or the dependency API returns lookup fields in this format. Can you imagine? Like NF, I don't know, who knows what that means? And then two random IDs. That is really how the tool API returns you a lookup filter dependency. And again, I'm very perfectionist with this thing. So I was like, either I'm gonna exclude that dependency from Happy Soup or I'm gonna fix it because I don't want to put that, you know, as a metadata item on the tree. So I had to figure out what was Salesforce thinking when they came up with this. And to make it worse, when it's a standard object, then the format is like this. It's the actual name of the object and then that second ID. So it is different for custom objects and standard objects. So here again, I take the lookup filter name, I split it, then I get the field ID and then the object ID. And then I put them on the map. And again, I need to then create a query to query their parent record to figure out what is actually the name of this object. Because I know it's an object, I just have no idea who that is. So I create a query somewhere there. Let's see what does it do actually. Where is the, well, let's just go to it. Yeah, so I just, right, so I select the fields, and I think in these fields, it's already included the actual parent name. And where did that go? Look at filters here. And so once I have that, then again, a lot of maps, like there's so many maps in Happy Soup, right? So I need to keep track of the developer names of the fields by their actual ID. And then later again, I need to query the entire org and say, get me all the object names of all the objects in the org and give them to me in a map by their ID. And then finally, again, I go through the lookup filters that the tooling API gave me, and I start going through them one by one. And then I start getting stuff from the maps. And then with that, I am able to actually construct the object name. And some quirks here is that, for example, you see this if object name, then the full name is object name dot field name. But if it's not, then it's entity ID. You'll be like, what the hell is that? Well, the object name that I get here, which is from a map of objects by ID that I get from the metadata API, only works for for custom objects. So for standard objects, it actually returns nothing. Like, don't ask me why. So I know that if this returns false, it's because we're dealing with a standard object, in which case the entity ID is the name of the standard object. I mean, there's so much stuff like that. Like honestly, it's yeah, it's been fun, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. And it's given me so much knowledge of how the tooling API works or doesn't.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, so there's a lot of complexity in building something like this. And so let me show you the next one here, and then we can move on to deployment boundaries. Um, well, another thing that I showed you here is that so flows, right? You have no idea, is this a process builder? Is it a flow? Are these active? If they are inactive, then you actually don't care about those things, you know? Um, so again, the API doesn't tell you that. So Happy Soup obviously does. So as you can see, gives you two different pieces of data here. It tells you the type of flow. So anything that says actual flow, like all launch flow or trigger flow or screen flow, it's a flow. And then process builder is a process builder, right? And then you can also see which ones are active and which ones are not. And again, this is all about being able to make that, understanding the true impact of making a change to that field. Because again, if that field is just being used in a flow that is in an invalid draft, maybe it's a draft that wasn't even saved properly, then it's okay, right? Or maybe it is on a process builder that is actually a draft version as well. It's not actually being used, but maybe it's not used on the active one. In this case, it is, right? But let's say if it wasn't, then again, this gives you a lot of information right there on the spot that you can use to make a decision about what to do with that field. And the other thing that I don't do by default, and I'll show you why, is that for reports, right? What I said earlier is we don't know how this report is using the field. And that's actually very important because when it comes to pick list values, I learned well, not the other day, before I created this specific feature that I'm going to show you, I learned that if you have a report that uses a field as a filter, right? Let's say customer priority equals high, and you delete that field, the filter on the report just disappears, and Salesforce doesn't tell you anything. So suddenly your report doesn't have that filter, and it will show you a lot more data, and nobody knows until maybe you'll get a case from your boss or someone saying, why is there so much data on this report? So then I realized it's actually, again, just knowing the classes is not good enough. Knowing which reports are used in the field is not good enough as well. And so that's where we come here to the toppings, where the first one is show whether the field is used in reports for filters, groupings, or columns, but this is only available for the first 100 reports. What this means is that if your field is used in more than 100 reports, which is the case in my production org, I'm only going to show you that level of detail for the first 100. And there are two reasons for that. One is if I do more than 100 API calls, because I need to make one API call per report, unfortunately. The report API doesn't support bulk operations. If I do more than that, Salesforce starts blocking my request. And like Salesforce just throttles your your IP address at the load balancer. And I know that because one, I used to work in Salesforce and I used to get those cases all the time when I used to work in Salesforce support. Second, I logged the case with Salesforce when this started happening here, and they told me that they couldn't even see my requests on their server logs. And it's because the response that I was getting, like a 404, was actually from the load balancer. So it's like it wouldn't even pass the network. It would just say way too many requests, go away. So I decided, okay, anyway, what's the point of knowing that information for 400 reports? I mean, if you have that many reports, you have a bigger problem, right? So I'm
Yeah.
just going to show you that for 100 reports, and for the rest, then deal with it. So let me do that again. It's going to take a bit longer because again, it needs to do one API call per report. And so there you go, right? So now again, three scenarios here. The report can actually use the field in multiple capacities. I use the same logic that I showed you for the Apex class. I'm assuming that if it's there, it's definitely a column, which means view only, or at a minimum, it has to be a column. So I only do matching for groupings and filters. And if I don't get that, then I assume that it's view, that it's a column. Other thing that can happen is that the report could be on someone else's private folder. And even if you're an admin, you can't see it. So rather than just throwing an error, I actually, just tell you that, sorry, you can't tell you that information. And the other thing is that a report can use the field in multiple capacities. It could be all three. It could be a column, it could be a filter, and it could also be a grouping. In this case, it is the two of them. It is a grouping and it is a filter. And not only it tells you that it's a filter, it actually tells you what the filter is and how amazing that is, right? So you know that the account customer priority field is filtered by equals low on this report. So if you were to remove, or if you were thinking of renaming or removing the low value from that pick list, right there, you would know that that's a report that's going to break. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And that's super valuable, you know. I've definitely been there before where I have thought a field is 100% good to get rid of, and then for some reason it was leveraged in a report in that way, and I've got I received complaints that it disappeared, which, you know, wasn't great.
Yeah.
It didn't end up great.
Right.
um but yeah, I mean, that's also some interesting, I feel like everything I do in Salesforce, um that of decent development size. Obviously, this is way more than decent development size. There's some crazy thing I never knew, and that's definitely one of them. The that you make those call outs and they throttle you eventually, and yeah, I mean, that's pretty interesting. I definitely
Yeah. And
didn't know that was a thing.
the worst thing is that they'll actually throttle the customer, not happy soup, because the calls are being made to the customer's org, so they can also throttle them as well. I mean, they could block my IP address, but they could also end up reaching out to the customer and saying, hey, what are you doing? Because there's so many API calls coming into your org. So yeah, I need to be careful because I don't want to block my own app, and I also don't want to cause issues for the customer. And well, unfortunately, here is that the reporting API only, you can only describe a report one at a time. Uh, so again, if it was some bulk operation, then it would be fine. But so let me walk you through this very quickly, right? So I assert a max report count, and I explain exactly there what it is. Also, as you can see, there's a filter there by options. There's an options object that is passed to this API, which is this options here. So if that wasn't ticked, then we just totally exit, and we don't even do that anymore. I mean, we don't even pass that line. But if it's enabled, then we go on, right? So what we do is, okay, if we have more than 100 reports, I'm not gonna just then not show the other 100. I'm still gonna show them in Happy Soup, but there's gonna be like a label or like a pill that says unavailable due to max report count exceeded or something like that. So then I split them in, the ones that I'm gonna include for the analysis and the ones that I'm going to exclude, meaning I'm still going to show them, but I'm not going to do the analysis of how they're using the field. So then I get the reports API, which is just an abstraction that I created on the reports API. And then I say, okay, then get the report metadata. So actually, I don't think I can I show this? Yeah, yeah, I can. So this is just, again, just a quick or just a tiny file that I created just to abstract that. But this is essentially just doing a describe on the report ID. And as you can see, it's one at a time. And so then what I do is I get a list of report IDs, and then I do a promise all, which is, iterate through all of them. And for each one, do an asynchronous JavaScript callout, which is this thing here, and then get me the information from that report, and then I return it to the caller. So there is separation of concerns, right? Not all the code is just thrown in there, like you saw earlier. So, okay, so now, again, quirks of the API is that if it's not available, let me actually read this. Let's see what I wrote. So when the data is accessible to the running user, the response comes as a single JSON object. Yeah. But if the report is in a private folder, the response comes in an array format. Why? I don't know. But so, yeah, if the report is unavailable to you, the response is actually an array of errors, even though there's just one error. If the report is available to you, you get a JSON object. So then here again, what I do is, okay, if it's not an array, then I know I have access to this report. If it's not, then I think later I filter by this map, and I know if it's not on this map, it's because it returned an array, which meant that I didn't have access to it. So anyway, as to how the filters work. So once you get the report metadata, the actual JSON that you get is pretty useful. Unfortunately, you need to do this very nasty if first, just to make sure that you have all the data. But essentially what you're saying is, if the report has groupings and one of the groupings key is actually the entire API name of the field, then you know this field is being used as a grouping. And so I push that. Here's a very clear example of, again, a misplaced responsibility, because why should the API be concerned about the color of these being red, right? This should actually probably be on the front end. But again, at least I'm being honest about the shortcomings of the code. Then if it's a filter, then again, it'll be the report metadata is going to have like a report filters array. And so I go through all the filters, and if the column of the filter matches the field name, Then I push a pill. A pill is this thing here. And the pill is going to be the filter and the filter operator and the filter value, which is what you're seeing right here. But again, if there wasn't a match at all, so if I didn't even get it here because it was never on the map, and again, it was only in the map if it was a valid JSON. So if it's not there at all, then I know, okay, it's because I didn't have access to it. So I'm just going to add this label saying that it's unavailable. And then for the ones that were excluded, I will add another field saying not calculated too many reports. So again, looks like three tiny things, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of very complicated logic to do this. And then the last piece that I want to show you just before, because I know this is already 45 minutes, it's I'm going to show you this one, which is showing if the field is referenced in custom metadata types of field definition field types, which I know sounds like a tongue twister, but let me explain in a second. So again, this is totally not, this is a brand new metadata type that happens, not a brand new metadata type, but it's a metadata type that is not at all returned by the tooling API. So this is 100% manual searching of those metadatas and see if they match. So essentially what this is saying is that this custom metadata type is using that field, customer priority, on a field definition field. So if I open that, you'll see right there, this field, SRM field, the type of field is a field definition, which is like a new field type that Salesforce introduced a few releases ago. So if I click on this, this actually points to the actual field. It's not like just like an ID or the name. And so this was very important for one of the people that was using Happy Soup because they leverage custom metadata types a lot, and they use this a lot where they could, um, link objects and fields directly to the metadata type, and they wanted to be able to see which metadata types were referenced in that field. And so that again consumes a lot of calls, so that's an extra option. And the last thing that I want to show you, just because I think it's cool, is that, as I said earlier, there's a lot of other metadata types that you can do the same type of analysis. And there are enhancements for other ones as well, not just for fields. So if I go here to custom label, what was the name of this custom label? Hold on. Oops, custom labels. No. It was not a custom label. Sorry, it was an email template that I wanted to show you. Yeah, you're still there, right?
I'm still here. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
just.
You're just wowed. You're just speechless.
Hey, man. There's a reason that I wanted to talk to you about this, and in my opinion, I mean, there's a lot of great apps people have built out there, but this is of the many that I've used, my personal favorite. So, yeah, man, it's a very impressive thing you've built here for sure.
Thanks. Okay, so let me show you this last one of email templates. So think about it. So where can an email template be used? Well, it can be used directly in an Apex class, right? However, if it's used in an Apex class, it may not be used at all by its ID. It could be used by its name and not even its full name. Like in Apex, you could do a SQL query against the email template object using where the name like X. So you're not saying the full name, but where the name starts with this, and then you loop over those templates and you use them in Apex in some way, which obviously the metadata API would never call because it's dynamic. The other thing, and let me just show you here. And I know this because we use this in my company, is what if you're actually using the email template in a custom label, right? Why not? Imagine if you have some framework that is doing some that sends emails and to different users or whatever, and you want that framework to be customizable, you could very well use email templates in custom labels, meaning the custom label value could be the email template name, or maybe the ID, or maybe the label. it could be all three. You know, who knows? Nothing stops you from doing that. So what I'm
Yeah.
showing you here is that I actually have all three. So this template is called marketing product inquiry response. So I have a custom label that uses the API name as the value. I have another one that uses the template ID and another one that uses the label. All three are valid, right? I mean, who says that you couldn't do something like that if you wanted? And this is where Happy Soup really shines, if I'm being modest, is that I put a lot of thought into all the weird things that people can do. And I don't know of any other way that you could figure out that your email template is somehow being used in custom labels in this way. The other thing is that, again, and this is not a great feature, but what I'm trying to show you here, you see this is not a real metadata type, right?
Right.
What I'm
Yep.
trying to show you here is that there's an Apex class that queries the email template object. So it may or may not use your email template. So I'm just telling you, you should look for that because it may use it. But I can't tell because again, the SQL query filter could be something that would never match the email template ID, name, or label. So
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that type of analysis. But what I do is I know that this class queries the email template object. And then therefore you should maybe check and see if the query filter would return the email template that you're making changes to, right?
Yeah.
And again, there's a lot of code for that, where essentially I get, for custom labels, I get all the custom labels in the org and then I just match by name, ID, or label.
See,
Okay,
now you're getting into dangerous territory. I've I've done this a similar thing, although not with a custom label. I've done it with a custom metadata type, and I think foolishly a long time ago, a custom setting. But um, yeah, man, I mean, it's impressive that you've even built that because that is, I'm sure, no small feat. So um, yeah,
right. So let me show you the last thing just because, you know, we now it's 51 minutes, very nice chat, but I'm sure the viewers will need a break at some point. So the next feature that I wanted to show you is, so this is a brand new concept that I honestly, I guess, made up, myself. So imagine that, you and I are working together just like we are right now, and I have this class in my org. Now, for the record, I don't edit classes directly on setup. It's just that I don't have this org connected to my Visual Studio Code because it's just a trailhead. So I didn't bother to do that. But yeah, I don't code here. Um, but so I have this test class, right? Which, as you can see, uses some data factory to insert some test data. And then it does some queries against some objects that exist in my org, like a Jira ticket and stuff like that. Now imagine if you were to tell me, hey Pablo, can you give me that org so that I can put it in my own org? I can say, yeah, sure. Here it is, copy paste, send it to you over Slack. And if you paste this in your org and you try to deploy, you're gonna get 1,000 errors, right? Because you don't have this object, you don't have this field, I don't know, some field from this object, you don't even have this class in your org. And even if you had that class, do you have all the objects that that class references? Because that's a test data factory. So for sure, that class references a bunch of objects that just don't exist in your org. So it's almost impossible. It's pretty much impossible for you to do that unless you knew everything that is needed for this class to exist in another org. So think about it, right? The class needs something. It needs the custom object. And if it uses some fields from other objects, those fields need the object that they belong to. So there's a whole hierarchy of things that need to exist in the org before this class can even exist there. And that concept, I named it deployment boundaries. And there's actually a very nice article on Salesforce Ben about it. So I would encourage you and the viewers to read it. But essentially, the concept that I'm trying to bring to the ecosystem is that before we used to think of our Salesforce org as as a bunch of metadata, you know, just everywhere. But really, with this new concept, if you think about it, your org is actually a group of deployment boundaries where, say, you have a workflow rule. I know this doesn't look too clear, but this workflow rule depends on this custom field, which is a formula. And this field depends on another field, again, because it's a formula. Then somewhere else in the org, you have a lining component that depends on a custom field, and that field depends on some other fields. So if you start drawing this boundary, you realize that actually it's not a happy soup. It's just a group of deployment boundaries, but these deployment boundaries don't necessarily depend on each other. If I could take this chunk of metadata, put it in your org, then you would be able to work on the top level component just as if you were in my org, because you have everything that that top level component needs to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? More
Yeah,
or
yeah.
less. So the whole article goes into a lot more detail. So why would this be useful? Well, again, if I wanted, well, the example that I gave is a bit silly, right? Because why would you want my class, right? But if you were thinking of maybe creating a scratch org, right? Maybe you want to do development on this class. Where is it? Um, Here. Maybe you want to do development on this class in a scratch org, and obviously you can't unless you pull I mean, what you would normally do is you would push the entire org into a scratch org, which totally defeats the purpose of the scratch org. But if you can preload the scratch org with the deployment boundary of this class, then you could literally just copy paste this class in your org and it would work, because now your scratch org has everything that it needs to exist. So I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's because it's very important for the concept to be clear. So let me actually show you what the deployment boundary for this Apex class would look like. So I have it here already. It's again a happy soup, and the difference is here you would choose what it depends on and or deployment boundary. So when you click search to do some dark magic, and then it comes up with this, which looks like it's very much the same, except if I go here to Apex classes, now we see that it's a little different. What this is telling me is that this class depends on some classes, which are this one. So if I click on that, that's actually another class. And that class itself depends on other things, right? Because it's not as simple as saying, oh, okay, create this class in your org, and then suddenly you'll be able to create this one. No, you also need to have in your org everything that this class depends on. And so this class depends on some custom fields. It also depends on other classes. And lo and behold, those classes also have their own dependencies like custom fields and custom objects. So you can keep going down the hierarchy here. And essentially, this is again, now repeated, everything that needs to exist in any org for this top level component to exist. So if you're able to retrieve all this from my org, push it in your org, you can work on this top level component exactly as if you were in my org. So that is what a deployment boundary does. And of course, it would be useless if I just showed it to you like this, and then you're like, okay, but how do I retrieve it? So there's a package XML button that you can just, click there, and then it'll, let me just bring the file here. Then it'll download a package XML, nicely formatted. And here is where this matters. Remember, I was telling you earlier that unfortunately the tooling API does not return the parent object name on the
Mm-hmm.
fields. So then it would be useless for the purposes of exporting it or retrieving it through the metadata API, because you would only get this. And then how do you know which objects those fields belong to? Fields could have the same name across objects, which is actually very common. And so if you just have this, then you would, then you still have to go through the org manually and do the whole thing yourself. And so that's why that method earlier was doing that, so that you could do this. And again, now that you have the package XML, I can retrieve this, you deploy it in your org, and now we can start working on this class in completely different orgs. And this class doesn't even know. It doesn't even know that it's not in the original org. So that's what the deployment boundary is. And I'll show you the code quickly, but do you have any questions or comments on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, one of the nice things about this, right, is that you kind of went over it. It is that if you want, you know, to leverage scratch orgs, it makes it a little bit simpler, right? You can now figure out, okay, I want to work on these 3 or 4 classes in my scratch org. That's what I need to work on. Now I can just come here, basically say, give it the names of my classes one by one, figure out what I need, generate the package XML, merge those together, and then deploy it to your scratch org. Whereas alternatively, right, it would be a very manual, painstaking process trying to go through each and every one of those. You've really simplified the the most complicated portion, I think, anyway, of figuring out how to get things together to even use in a scratch org, right? So for some of the bigger orgs, it can take literally months. So
Yeah. And well, if I run this in my production org, this tree, I would be scrolling for like 30 seconds. Um, so let me show you the code because so going back to your question, right? Initially, what made you create Happy Soup? This concept was the original intention that I had. The whole impact analysis thing was actually an afterthought because it's the reverse of what I'm showing you here. This is actually much more complicated than the impact analysis because here you need to recursively query every single item that you get, not hit limits of the API or even JavaScript memory limits, which I did hit at some point, and still be able to enhance the data so that you can, attach the parent name prefix to those things. And actually here, this is the example where I told you that if you want to build a data dictionary, which is not, it's not intuitive that you can do this with Happy Soup, but if you pull a page layout, then you can see that the only option that is available is the fields using the layout. And if you think about it, the same applies. If you want to deploy this page layout to another org, you need all the fields and all the objects that those fields depend on. So by a happy coincidence or mistake, if you get the deployment boundary of a page layout, suddenly you get a list of all the fields that it uses. And just like that, you have a data dictionary of the page layout. And you can export it to Excel here or CSV. Um, but so this was my original intention when building Happy Soup. And the intention was to create something that I could understand the dependencies of something. And once I knew that, then okay, what does this other things depend on? And keep going until I get to the very last thing that is needed. And only when I showed this to someone, somebody told me, hey, it would be great if you could do the reverse. And it was rather simple because I had already spent months figuring out the algorithm for this part. Um, so let me show you the code here very quickly. I mean, it doesn't look that much complicated, but at least to me, mentally it was. It was very complicated to come up with this. Um, so same concept. I get an entry point, which is like the object or the Apex class name, ID, and a connection object so that I can log into the API. Then I create a recursive query. And this looks kind of funky, right? So you have this recursive dependency query function, which returns a query. And then I do an asynchronous call to this where I execute a query and then I get the results. So it kind of looks weird, right? Why do you execute it first and then you later get the results? Why doesn't this return the results? And well, it's because this query object is like a wrapper for that recursive operation that I need to do. So I cannot just return it in one go. I need to actually do all of them and aggregate all the information. And only when it's ready will the code pass this line and then I can do get results. So the query is, it's very like, even gives me goosebumps just to look at it again, because it was so complicated to do this, because there's so many weird cases. What happens if in the tree, in the dependency tree, you have a repeated object or a
Mm.
repeated metadata type? Do I start doing the tree all over again? Right? You could have that. You could have an Apex class depend on another one, and then somewhere down the line, the top level class or one of the classes in the middle is referenced yet again. So you need to keep track that something you have already queried dependencies of that, so you don't have to do it again. Otherwise, your tree will be infinite, and you get a recursive, you get a circular reference in JSON, and then the whole thing would blow up. So
Yeah.
I have this, like this array of IDs that I have already queried, and then I create a dependency query, which is just the actual raw query to the uh, tooling API. As you can see, I use this use tooling true. Um, and then let me go back. Is there a way that I can hit back and actually just go? Okay, anyway, here I am. Um, right, so I create that query, and I query. This is just for the initial subset, like one ID, right? You start with one ID, the Apex
Mhm.
class ID. You do that query and you get the results. Then I simplify them, which just means removes the names. The names of the actual tooling object is very complicated to read, so I just simplify that a bit. Then I have, okay, this next level IDs, which is, okay, for the next level, I need to capture the IDs, but I need to make sure that it hasn't been queried already, because if I have, then I need to skip it. So I do some logic there to make sure that it doesn't do that, because obviously, again, you will get a circular reference. And I also tag them as repeated, so that I know that, okay, it's already been there. And anyway, if it's not already been queried and it's not a dynamic reference, which we're not going to go over, then I say, okay, this is the push them to the next level array. And then I call the exec function, which is exactly where I am. So this
Mhm.
is recursion. You're just calling the same function from itself over and over again. But because it's in a JavaScript closure, which means that this function is inside this other function, then the parent function keeps sort of a state of the
Yeah.
inner function. And so this result, and ID is already queried, will remember the previous execution of the inner function, so that the next time this ID is already queried, it's not empty again, but it has what the previous execution added. And so the result also gets updated all the time. And so when we're done with that, we can call this get results to actually return the result object. So once you have that, the most complicated part, that was complicated, but then you again have to enhance some of the custom field data. You need to create some unsupported dependencies. That is, there are some dependencies that the API doesn't return at all, and that they would actually be needed for the deployment boundary concept to be true. So for example, if you have a field called account to custom underscore underscore C, and that is a lookup to custom object, the custom object is not returned by the API as a dependency, which is obviously wrong, because you need that custom object before you can have a lookup to that object. Does that make sense? You
Yeah.
cannot have a lookup field pointing to an object that doesn't exist, and the API doesn't tell you that. So here I identify which are those scenarios, and I manually query those dependencies, so that I can build the tree. And then there's a lot of logic here, which I'm not going to go over because I honestly don't remember how it works, to create the actual JSON tree. And man, this part is so messy. Like here it gets ugly, right? So I had this init tree, uh, like, I mean, it's very hard to read because you essentially need to create, one tree node per each metadata type, but it
Yeah.
needs to allow for more. And I need to keep track of the references that it has so that I don't duplicate them. And I mean, I think I've only had to modify this twice since I created it, and the second time was as hard as the first time. Like I felt like I was reading someone else's code, like because it's yeah the logic is very complicated. But essentially here I create the tree, and then I need to reorder the nodes so that they make sense, and then I need to actually clean some references because some of those references will be duplicated. Now, I think we spoke enough about the code. One thing that I wanted to mention is that this whole logic that actually I'm showing here is on an npm package called sfdc soup. It's actually not the same as Happy Soup. So Happy Soup is the web app, which on GitHub is here, the sfdc Happy Soup, which is the main repository, which has all the code for the front end and back end. But the actual API that I've been showing you is a different project that I also own called SFDC Soup, which is just the lower level API that does, the magic of everything that I've been showing you is on that module. Putting the data in Excel and creating the JSON tree, creating the package XML, even there's a stats object, which is what powers the chart here. All that is actually done by this module. And so you could actually create your own apps by just using this module directly in JavaScript. And so the module is pretty well documented. I explain here, what you need to pass to it, and how do you get the usage information, how do you get the deployment boundary or the dependency information. And then there's a lot of information about the actual response, like the package XML, the dependency trees. It's here, see, I actually return a JSON tree, and it's Happy Soup, the web app, that then consumes this tree and creates the nice UI that you see there. But the whole thing has been abstracted to its own module so that, if you don't want to use Happy Soup because maybe you think you can do a better UI, which I'm sure many people can, then you can just take the module and build your own thing. I know Accenture is actually building a project called SF Power Scripts here. This is a project by Accenture, which is very complicated. I haven't had a chance to go over it, but it's about package-based development or deployment. And they actually use SFDC Soup to generate impact analysis charts. So that's very nice. That I didn't expect people to actually use it, but they were writing their own, and then they realized this one had a bit more functionality. And so even the pills, where you can see if the Apex class is using it for write or read, all that is actually here. Happy Soup, the web app, is a completely different beast, and all it does, it's concerned about the front end, the whole UI, which we're not going to go over, and then the back end, which is actually interesting. It has different things, like it has a Redis database because I cache some of the data to make sure that some requests are actually faster and that I do less API calls to the org. And it has error logging and stuff like that. And the actual where I guess the magic happens again here is in this API router, where here is where we pass jobs to the web app. So for example, if I want to get the usage, meaning that where is this used, the web app actually sends a request to this URL, Happy Soup slash API slash usage. And then here we get the entry point, which again is like Apex class name, Apex class ID, Apex class metadata type. We create a job off of that. I create a job ID, which is a combination of the Salesforce org ID, username, and then a unique timestamp. And then I put that job on the queue, which then later gets processed by this worker. And here this worker actually is, well, it's actually just passing the jobs to this jobs module, where this is where the actual jobs are made. So for example, here the usage job we get the entry point, we get the session ID, we get the cache, we get the connection from Salesforce, and then here is where we use that module that I was showing you earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Just this line, literally, that's it. Like all the other stuff is just all the infrastructure, the worker queue, the backend, the session ID, making sure that you have a valid session with Salesforce, making sure that you have the required cookies, that you're on HTTPS. A lot of overhead, literally just to support these two lines. Um, just kind of sad, but um, yeah. So both objects or both projects are open source, right? So that's the SFDC soup. And then the other one, the main one is Happy Soup, which again has a lot of information there on the deployment boundaries. It also explains how it bypasses the limitations of the metadata component dependency API, which is what I explained to you. There's a lot of information about security, what I do with your data, because I don't do anything, but it needs to store the access token for a while. And so I explained there how it does that. And then there are options for deploying to your own Heroku account. We're not going to go over that, but we did mention it. So if you don't want to use HappySoup as a web app because you're concerned about security, which is totally fair, you can deploy it to your own Heroku account. Obviously, the big problem with doing that is that you don't get updates, right? So if I fix bugs or I introduce new features, I have no way of telling you that, hey, something, well, I could tell you, but I have no way of knowing who's actually using their own version of Happy Soup, which is kind of one of the drawbacks. There's also information on how to use it with Docker, and there's a link to the YouTube video on my YouTube channel where I explain how to use it, how to install it with Docker. It's actually very simple. There's just like a Docker file already there on the main web app, and you just need to follow the video. There's just a couple of commands, and it just creates the whole thing for you. And then there's a privacy policy there because I do need to explain a little bit about how, I'm in Europe, so we're pretty paranoid when it comes to data. So
Yeah.
I need to be very careful that I don't get sued by by someone. So I need to be very clear about what I actually collect in terms of your personal identifiable information, your Salesforce orgs metadata, and then I need to explain, like, if you want to be forgotten, here's how you can remove complete access to Happy Soup. If you want to email me so that I can tell you what data I have from you, then that's also an option. Um, and yeah, so it's open for collaboration. I mean, I always feel like, people say, oh, it's anyone can contribute. And I've always felt like, how do people contribute to an open source project? You have no idea the architecture or anything about that. It's not like you can just go in and download it and, okay, let me add this code here and put a
Yeah.
pull request and that's it. Like, it just doesn't work like that. Or if it is, then the realization that people work like that is what drives the imposter syndrome. So it is available for that, but I know it just that's not how it happens. So recently I got someone to help me on a particular issue that I want to fix, which is when it comes to matching standard fields to Apex classes, the logic is not awesome. So I'm not gonna go over that, but I did log an issue where I explained the entire thing of what the problem is, and there's some alternative libraries that we could use, and then how we could also use the symbol table to maybe fix this problem. So somebody contacted me, actually this guy, Daniel, and he's gonna work on that. But that's how I could see that people could collaborate on this, is that if I log a proper bug and I explain, okay, in this line of code, this thing is happening and this thing is happening here, and this is what should happen, then anyone can come in and even if it's just give ideas, just give me a link to an article that gives some information. That is collaboration. It doesn't have to be that you submit a whole pull request with a brand new feature. And then also last thing is somebody also gave a really good idea the other day here on a discussion about bulk field impact analysis, which I plan to
Yeah.
implement so that you could take like 10 fields or even 10 different things of different metadata types and like, maybe 5 fields and 5 classes and 2 flows, and then boom, give me the entire impact analysis of all this. I have no idea how to do that, to be honest. I don't think I can do it on the fly. So I think it's gonna have to be like a synchronous job, and then maybe email the person some PDF or something. And I have
Mm.
no idea how to do any of that. So it's gonna take time. But yeah, if anyone has ideas in that, again, this is open for you to come in here and just put your thoughts.
Well, that was going to be, you kind of answered one of the questions that I was going to ask you before we, wrap this up is, well, first I'll say before I ask the question, I think what, at least from my experience from looking at things, I feel like most of the contributors, to open source open source projects, are people who have basically spent enough time with it to notice that there's this one thing that doesn't always go quite right, and then they decide to dive deep into it and fix it, more or less. So similar to what you've put a bug in there or an issue in there. But I feel like half the time, at least, most of the contributions that I end up seeing, so that people don't feel too bad about not contributing to open source software a lot, is that they just, they latch on to one that's really well made, and they use it a bunch, and they figure out, oh, there's this one thing that bothers me that always happens for, you know, X situation. And then they just decide to go out and build it and then submit a pull request. And sometimes it goes through and sometimes it doesn't. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, like you said, though, it's hard
yeah, it
to
is.
be able to go into, especially an app of this size, and be like, yeah, I can contribute to this easily, you know.
Yeah,
It just doesn't work
yeah.
quite that way, unfortunately. um
Yeah, but anyway, but it's open for that. If anyone wanted to
yeah.
bring ideas or discussions, I think that's probably the best way that they can collaborate. Again, I'm not trying to say that they are unable to provide code collaboration, but it's just very hard. It's just very hard because even I have a hard time reading my own code that I wrote 10 months ago, right? And
Hmm.
so probably ideas and discussions around new features or something that doesn't work quite well is probably the best way at this point to collaborate on this.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask was, you're kind of alluding to some of it, I think, but you know Happy Soup is already this wonderful thing that, I mean, honestly, everybody should just be glad exists, and that it exists for free. But I know you've, I think, told me anyway that you have some plans in the future for what you'd like to see it um, do or evolve into. So, um, are you able to go into, what you'd like it to be able to do in the future?
Yeah. So there's a lot of things. So first of all, I need to refactor the entire front end because I I'm doing pure DOM manipulation. Like I'm not using any JavaScript library or anything like that, which is kind of crazy. But I did it on purpose because I wanted to learn JavaScript well. Um, Now that's great for learning, but now for it to scale, I can't just write that much JavaScript. Like I need to stop, right? And just the backend has enough logic, as you saw already, for me to be spending time in the front end, also writing a bunch of JavaScript and DOM manipulation. So right now I'm actually learning Vue, Vue.js, and my plan is to migrate the entire front end to Vue, and that's gonna take a while, I'm sure, but my hope is that once it's in that state, then one, it's easier to understand, and two, it's not a black box of DOM manipulation. If anyone wanted to contribute and they know Vue very well, there's already a set of patterns that they can follow. So that is sort of the first thing. Um, the other thing that I've thought about is maybe making it an Electron app, which means making it a desktop app, something like Visual Studio Code, which is actually like it's a Node.js app, but on Electron, which means it can run on a desktop, or even the old school Maven's Mate, right? Used to be a Node.js app running on your computer locally thanks to a framework called Electron. Because I think the problem with HappySoup is that because it runs on my Heroku account, a lot of people are concerned that I'm actually, secretly stealing all their opportunities in the night and selling them to some island in the Caribbean. And that's just not at all the case, right? Because one, I have no benefit of doing that. And Salesforce is my career, right? So I wouldn't do anything remotely similar. But in the end, I do have access to the access token temporarily. The moment the person logs out or after 2 hours, the access token is killed automatically because that's what I've configured on the API session settings. But so there is a security concern, and I get it. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, it totally makes sense. It's available as a Docker, but not everybody knows Docker. There's a lot of people that are just not that I guess technical, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like if you're an admin or someone that is just not into development the way we are, then why should you learn Docker and a bunch of commands to be able to benefit from the tool? And then deploy into your own Heroku account that has the drawback of you'll be totally out of sync with what is happening. So I think what needs to happen for HappySoup to really get to the next level is for it to be a desktop app that you can just download once and run it forever with updates and all that without you having to worry about me stealing your Salesforce data. I think once I can achieve that, the adoption would be a lot more. Which is kind of funny because I think how the only reason people don't trust it is because I'm an individual. But if I was a company, they would still have the exact same access. Like, and I know this because I wrote the app, so I know how no matter how much database security or whatever, if a company wanted, they could still take, the session ID and do something with it. So it's kind of
Yeah.
funny that we as individuals we trust a company that we're actually paying, but when it's an individual, we are a bit more. I guess there's this sort of false sense of security when it's a company that that it's more safe, but really any app that has access to your Salesforce data should be evaluated properly, and that applies to HappySoup. So I'm fully transparent about that. If people don't want to use HappySoup because they have security concerns, that is 100% valid. So I think I really want to make it a desktop app to alleviate that concern once and for all.
One more question I'll ask before we'll call it quits here is just, um, okay, I know that you've got the GitHub um, yeah, account, obviously where Happy Soup is hosted. Um, but are there other ways that people can get in contact with you? I know there's Slack channel, whatever else, but how could they get in contact with you if they want to help with the app or just learn more about the app or anything along those lines?
Yeah, so you can contact me on GitHub here, right anywhere, like you said. Also, I think here on the SFDC soup, which is the main module, uh, at the bottom, my email is there. So they can just email me directly, and I have no problem with that. No one's done that yet, even though the email is there. And I think also here on the Happy Soup one at the bottom, it's also there, right? When I explain that if you want me to get rid of your data, then you can email me. And that is my personal email. So anyone can email me there. And then here as well, I think there's a link to my LinkedIn profile,
Mm.
which I'm not going to open because I don't know what notifications I may have there that I don't want my employer to see. I'm joking. But yeah, so you can just send me a message on LinkedIn. And the other thing actually is probably worth showing, so I will open LinkedIn, is that so there's a Happy Soup has actually a what we call it a LinkedIn page, right? So there's a lot of information there about the Slack channel. I also announced new features there. Also, Happy Soup was in a Salesforce Ben post about the top 30 apps for consultants. So I usually announce new features here as well, so anyone can just follow the page and they'll be notified of updates, and they can contact me through the page as well.
All right. Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much, Pablo, for agreeing to come on the show today and tell us a whole lot more about the app than uh, I even anticipated. So I appreciate it, and I'm sure that there are plenty of people, even if they don't write anything or post about it or contact you directly, that definitely appreciate that this app exists. Because I know, at least from personal experience, it's made my life quite a bit easier. So, um,
Yeah. No,
thanks again.
thank you very much for having me. It was great. It's always nice to talk about the app. You don't get the opportunity to talk in depth um, like this, so sometimes it gets pretty lonely. You know, I'm just there, just coding alone, with a glass of water.
Yeah.
Um, my wife is pretty technical too. My wife works in Salesforce, so I unfortunately she has to hear me a lot talking about Happy Soup and this new thing that I did, and she understands because she used to be a developer, but obviously it's not it's not the same as talking to someone who's actually really interested in understanding the architecture and the patterns and all that. So whenever I get the chance, I enjoy it a lot. So thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Yeah. Not a problem, man. Thank you.